It was a bright Saturday morning, and the sun had just begun to warm the quiet neighborhood. The streets were clean, the lawns trimmed, and the air filled with the soft hum of sprinklers and birdsong. Down by the edge of the gated community, a man named David parked his old pickup truck beside a dirt path. He stepped out wearing a faded cap and holding a worn folder under his arm. To anyone passing by, he looked like a man simply taking a walk, but for David, this wasn't just a casual visit. He was there for a reason. He looked across the stretch of land that lay behind the new row of houses. The ground was dry, covered in patches of grass and a few young trees that had clearly been planted recently. He could see the edge of a playground, children's swings shining in the sun and a walking trail curling through the field. It looked peaceful, but something about it didn't sit right with him. David took a deep breath and started walking slowly along the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped every few steps, glancing around, almost measuring the land with his eyes. He had walked this area years ago, back when it was nothing but open fields. But now the whole place looked different. Houses, fences, and even garden signs had taken over what once was untouched ground. As he reached the center of the open area, he knelt down and touched the soil. A small smile crossed his face, half nostalgic, half uncertain. This land, as far as he remembered, still belonged to him, part of the property his late father had left behind. He had never sold it, never leased it, and never received any notice of change. Yet here he was, standing in the middle of what looked like a neighborhood park. He was deep in thought when he heard a voice call out sharply behind him. "Hey, what are you doing here?" David turned around slowly. Two people were walking toward him, a man and a woman, both dressed neatly, wearing name tags that read HOA board. Their expressions were serious, almost suspicious. "Good morning," David said calmly. "Just taking a look around." The man crossed his arms. "This is private property. Only residents and guests are allowed here. You can't just wander in like that." David raised an eyebrow. "Private property, you say?" "Yes," the woman replied quickly. "This area belongs to the community association. We maintain it." "Do you live here?" "No," David said simply. "Then you need to leave," the man snapped. "We've had issues with trespassers before." David stayed quiet for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, just calm curiosity. "I see," he said slowly. "That's interesting because as far as I know, this land is part of a private parcel that hasn't been sold." The HOA members exchanged a quick look. The woman frowned. "That can't be right. The developer bought all this land years ago. It's been community property ever since." David gave a small, almost amused smile. "Maybe you should check the county records again. You might find something surprising." The man's patience seemed to wear thin. "Sir, if you don't leave, we'll have to contact security or the police." David didn't flinch. He looked out across the field again, the gentle wind brushing past his face. "That won't be necessary," he said softly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. Just making sure everything is still where it should be." The woman gave him a puzzled look. "What do you mean by that?" He turned to her with a calm expression. "I mean, sometimes people build things where they shouldn't." The two board members stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. Then the man shook his head. "Look, we don't want any problems. Just leave before this turns into a bigger issue." David nodded politely. Of course, he turned and walked back toward his truck. As he did, he glanced once more over his shoulder at the playground and the walking trail that had been built across what he was almost certain was his land. He didn't argue or raise his voice. He didn't need to. He knew the truth would come out soon enough. When he reached his truck, he opened the folder he'd brought with him. Inside were old documents, hand-drawn maps, property deeds, and tax papers with his father's name on them. He flipped through them carefully, then looked back toward the houses once more. A group of kids ran past, laughing, their parents watching from a distance. None of them had any idea that the ground beneath their feet might belong to someone else entirely. David got into his truck and sat there for a long moment, the engine still off. He could still hear the faint voices of the HOA members in the distance, probably talking about him. He smiled to himself. It wasn't anger that filled him, just a quiet sense of disbelief at how things had turned out. Years ago, his father had told him never to underestimate how fast land could change hands and how easily people could forget who really owned it. David hadn't paid much attention to that advice then. but now it echoed clearly in his mind. He finally started the engine and drove off slowly. The neighborhood faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by open road and fields that stretched far beyond. He knew what he had to do next. He wasn't going to argue with the HOA or shout at them in front of neighbors. He was going to do things the right way, the way his father would have. That morning had only confirmed what he already suspected. Somewhere along the line, someone had made a mistake, a big one. And while the HOA thought they were protecting their community, they had no idea they were standing on land that wasn't theirs. As the truck disappeared down the road, David glanced at the folder again, resting on the passenger seat. He gave a small nod, almost to himself. The next step would be to visit the county office and find out exactly what had happened. He wanted the truth, and he was ready to uncover it. For now, he let the wind blow through the open window, carrying the scent of dust and summer grass. He didn't feel angry or defeated. If anything, he felt calm. The land had always been part of his story, and today, it felt like that story was just beginning again. A few days after his encounter with the HOA members, David sat at his kitchen table early in the morning. The sun had just started to rise, casting soft light across the wooden floor. A cup of coffee sat next to him, growing cold as he flipped through the old documents again, the same ones his father had given him years ago. They were worn at the edges, some pages yellowed with time, but each paper told a story, one that was now more important than ever. He ran his fingers along the edge of a map, drawn by hand. His father had always been old-fashioned, preferring to keep records on paper instead of relying on anything digital. Back then, the land was nothing more than acres of open fields and wild grass. David remembered walking across it as a kid, chasing grasshoppers and collecting smooth stones by the creek. His father used to say, "One day this land will mean something even if it doesn't look like much now." At the time, David didn't understand what he meant. He had grown up, moved away, and started his own life. But after his father passed, he inherited everything: the land, the old farmhouse, and even the worn-out pickup that now sat in his driveway. He paid the property taxes each year without thinking much about it. It was just something he did out of respect for his father's memory. That was until a letter arrived last month. It came from the county office, listing recent construction and tax adjustments. There was a section mentioning new activity on part of his property, something about community development and subdivision expansion. The wording didn't make sense to him, but it caught his attention. How could there be construction on land he hadn't sold? That letter had started everything. At first, he thought it was a mistake. Maybe some paperwork got mixed up. But when he drove out there and saw the playground, the walking trail, and the shiny new fences, he knew it was something more. Someone had built on his land without permission. As he sipped his coffee, David thought back to that morning with the HOA. They had looked so confident, so sure that he was in the wrong. It almost made him laugh now, but deep down he wasn't angry. He just wanted the truth. He wanted to know how things had gone so wrong without anyone noticing. Later that day, he drove to the county recorder's office. It was a small brick building downtown, quiet except for the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. The woman at the front desk greeted him politely. "Good morning. How can I help you today?" she asked. David placed the folder on the counter. "I need to check the ownership records for a property just outside of town. I think there might be a mistake." She nodded and led him to a small computer terminal. Together, they entered the parcel number from his documents. A few seconds later, the screen filled with maps and digital records. The woman frowned slightly as she compared them. "That's strange," she said. "It looks like your property line hasn't changed in decades, but the new subdivision maps overlap part of it." David leaned closer. "How much of it?" She clicked a few more times. "About 4 acres, she said quietly. "That includes a section labeled as community parkland." David exhaled slowly. "So I still own that part?" "According to our records, yes," she said. "But the developer's documents say otherwise. Looks like someone didn't double-check before they started building." He thanked her and asked for printed copies of everything. When he stepped back into the sunlight, he stood still for a moment, holding the papers in his hands. It was one thing to suspect, but another to see it confirmed. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't trespassing. He was standing on land that was rightfully his. That evening, he called an old friend, someone who worked as a land surveyor. The man agreed to meet him out there the next morning. When the sun came up, They walked the property together, using old markers, maps, and modern tools to trace the real boundaries. By midday, the surveyor looked up from his notes with wide eyes. "David, you're not going to believe this," he said. "They built their walking path, half the playground, and even part of 2 backyards on your land." David didn't say anything at first. He just looked out across the field, where the sound of children laughing carried through the air. It felt unreal, as if someone had quietly erased his name from the land while no one was watching. "Can you mark it?" David asked. "Of course," his friend replied, pulling small flags from his bag. One by one, they placed them along the invisible lines of ownership. By the time they finished, bright orange flags cut straight through the middle of the park. It was a strange sight, like a line dividing 2 worlds. The next day, word spread fast. Some residents saw the flags and started asking questions. A few thought it was a new landscaping project. Others looked worried. The HOA board called an emergency meeting that same afternoon. When David arrived, the mood was tense. He could feel the eyes of the board members on him as he walked in. The man who had confronted him earlier sat at the head of the table, his arms crossed tightly. "Mr. David," the man said, "we understand you've been making claims about owning part of our community property. Is that correct?" "Not claims," David replied calmly. "Facts. The county records confirm it. I have copies right here." He placed the documents on the table. The room went silent as they flipped through the pages. The HOA president frowned deeper with each sheet. "This can't be right," one of them muttered. "The developer said they bought everything." David shrugged slightly. Then maybe the developer made a mistake. They didn't know what to say. The board members whispered among themselves, some visibly nervous. Finally, the woman from the first day looked up. "What do you plan to do?" she asked softly. David looked at her and smiled faintly. "For now, nothing. I just wanted you to know the truth. I'm not here to fight with anyone. But I do want things set right." He stood up, gathered his papers, and left the room. As he walked out, he could still hear the low buzz of voices behind him. They weren't angry anymore, they were worried. That night, as he sat on his porch, the crickets singing in the distance, David thought about everything that had happened. He could almost hear his father's voice again, calm and steady. Land is more than dirt. It's history. It's memory. Never let anyone take that away from you. He smiled quietly, watching the stars above. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted fairness for people to understand what was right. And he knew this was only the beginning. The HOA had built over his property, and soon they would have to face the truth. But he would handle it his way, with patience, with proof, and with the kind of calm strength his father had always taught him to have. Over the next week, David became a familiar face at the county records office. Every morning he'd show up with his worn folder and a notebook full of questions. He was polite, patient, and never in a rush. The staff started to recognize him, the quiet man who always said thank you and never left until he had a clear answer. He didn't want to accuse anyone or make a scene. He just wanted to know exactly how his land had ended up under someone else's control. On the 3rd day, he finally found what he was looking for. A clerk named Lisa helped him dig through the old records. She pointed to a line on a scanned document that caught his attention immediately. Years ago, when the new subdivision was being planned, the developer's legal team had filed a boundary survey. But the survey was missing one key page, the one that clearly marked the edge of David's property. Without it, the system had automatically registered the land as unclaimed. It was an error. A simple human mistake. But that mistake had turned into a playground, a walking path, and part of a neighborhood that now believed they owned everything. Lisa looked at him with an apologetic smile. "You're right, Mr. David. The paperwork wasn't completed properly. According to these records, the land was never sold or transferred. It still belongs to you." David nodded slowly, trying to take it all in. "So the developer built over land that wasn't theirs?" She hesitated. "It looks that way." He thanked her sincerely and gathered copies of every record she provided. It wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about proving himself right. He wanted the facts, not arguments. That afternoon, he sat in his truck outside the county building and looked through the documents again. Every page told the same story. The land was his, and it had been since his father's time. Somewhere between the paperwork and the bulldozers, someone had cut corners, and now an entire community was living on borrowed ground. David knew this wasn't something he could solve with just a few conversations. He needed someone who understood property law. So he called an attorney recommended by a friend, an older man known for being fair and honest. They met the next morning at a small law office on Main Street. The lawyer listened carefully as David explained everything. When he finished, the man leaned back in his chair and said, "You have a strong case. If what you're showing me is accurate, they've built part of their neighborhood on your property. You're within your rights to take legal action." David frowned slightly. "I don't want to start a war. I just want it corrected." The lawyer nodded. "Then we start simple. I'll draft a formal notice to the HOA and the developer. We'll attach your records and ask them to verify ownership through the county. Once they realize their mistake, we'll see how they respond." Within a week, the letters were sent. Copies went to the HOA president, the development company, and the county office. David didn't expect an immediate reaction, but it didn't take long. 3 days later, he received an email from the HOA board asking to meet again. When he arrived at the clubhouse, the atmosphere was different. The same people who had once looked at him like a trespasser now seemed nervous. The HOA president cleared his throat and said, "Mr. David, we received your documents. We've reviewed them with our legal counsel. It appears there may indeed be a boundary issue." David stayed quiet, letting them continue. The president sighed. "Our developer assured us that everything was purchased correctly, but now we see there might have been a mistake in the original transfer." One of the board members spoke up. "We'd like to work this out peacefully. We don't want tension in the neighborhood." David nodded. "Neither do I. I just want to make sure the records are right. I'm not looking to push anyone out of their homes." The woman who had confronted him earlier looked genuinely sorry now. "I hope you know we didn't mean to treat you unfairly that day. We just didn't know." He gave a small smile. "It's all right. You were doing what you thought was right. I understand." They discussed a few options: an official land survey, a boundary correction, or a purchase agreement if the HOA wanted to keep using the space. They agreed to start by bringing in an independent surveyor to verify the lines. David offered to be there for the inspection, not to argue but to make sure everything was done right this time. 2 days later, the surveyor arrived with his team. They used modern equipment to measure every inch of the disputed land. Neighbors gathered nearby, watching quietly as the team placed new markers in the ground. Every flag that went up seemed to tell the same story. The HOA's property line had crossed into David's land. By the time they finished, even the president couldn't deny the truth. When the final report came in, it confirmed it officially. Nearly 20% of the community's shared space was on David's property. The walking trail, the playground, even part of the fence line, all of it had been built outside the proper boundary. The HOA board met again, this time with more humility. The president spoke with a heavy voice. "Mr. David, on behalf of the homeowners, I want to apologize for the misunderstanding. We'll do whatever we can to make this right." David appreciated the sincerity, but he also knew this wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. "I understand," he said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about how things are done. Mistakes like this can cause real problems. I just want the process to be fair." The board agreed to enter negotiations with him and his lawyer. They discussed possible solutions, either moving the playground and trail or buying that portion of land from him at a fair market rate. David wasn't sure which way things would go, but one thing was clear: the truth was now out in the open. That evening, David sat in his truck again, watching the sun set over the same field where it had all begun. The laughter of children still echoed from the playground, and for the first time in weeks he felt at peace. He didn't blame the families or even the HOA anymore. It was just a mistake, a chain of careless errors that had gone unnoticed for too long. He looked down at the folder on the passenger seat, the same one that had started it all. Inside were the answers his father had left behind, quiet proof of their family's history. He smiled faintly, remembering his father's words, "Land remembers who it belongs to." Now, it seemed, that truth had finally been remembered. As the evening breeze moved across the open field, David knew there was still work ahead. Negotiations, paperwork, maybe even tough conversations. But for the first time, he didn't feel like an outsider or a trespasser. He was exactly where he was meant to be, on his own land, doing the right thing, one step at a time. A week later, David received a call from the HOA's lawyer. The voice on the other end was calm but serious. The association wanted to meet again. this time with their attorney and the property developer's representative present. David agreed, though he already knew what they were going to say. The truth was clear now, and everyone had seen the survey results. The only question left was what they would do about it. The meeting was held in the same clubhouse where it had all started. The mood was different this time, less defensive, more careful. Papers were spread across the long wooden table, maps and deeds lined up in neat piles. The HOA president looked uneasy, and the developer's representative sat with his hands clasped. Avoiding David's eyes, "Mr. David," the lawyer began, "first, we want to acknowledge that our client, the Homeowners Association, recognizes the boundary error. The land in question does in fact belong to you." David nodded slightly. "I appreciate that. It's not about blame. I just want this fixed properly." The lawyer continued. "The developer has also reviewed the records and admits that there was a mistake during the subdivision planning. The page missing from the original boundary file led to a misinterpretation of the property line." David stayed silent. He had already read every word of the report. He knew it wasn't just a missing page, it was negligence. But he didn't see any use in rubbing it in. The developer finally spoke up. "We're truly sorry for what happened, Mr. David. We never intended to build on your land. It was a clerical issue that slipped through during the transition between survey teams." David looked at him, calm but steady. "And now a part of your neighborhood is sitting on my property." The man nodded. "Yes, sir. It appears that way." The HOA president leaned forward. "We'd like to resolve this peacefully. The community values the park and walking trail, and we want to find a solution that works for everyone." David took a moment to think before responding. "I'm not here to take anything away from the families. I just want what's fair. I paid taxes on that land for years. I looked after it long before those houses were built. So whatever we decide, it needs to respect that." The HOA's lawyer adjusted his glasses and spoke again. "We understand completely. Our proposal is to purchase the section of land that overlaps with the community property. We can offer fair market value based on an independent appraisal." David considered it. He wasn't against selling, it wasn't about the money, but he wanted to be sure things were handled right this time. "If I agree to sell," he said slowly, "I want full transparency. Everything documented, approved, and filed correctly. I don't want another mistake 10 years down the line." "Of course," the lawyer replied quickly. "Everything will be done properly." The meeting lasted another hour, discussing details, deadlines, and survey confirmations. David remained calm through it all, never raising his voice, never demanding more than what was fair. When it ended, everyone shook hands. As he walked out of the clubhouse, he felt lighter than he had in weeks. The hard part was finally over, or so he thought. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the rooftops, David received an unexpected email from one of the residents. It was a kind message from a woman who lived near the park. She wrote, "I just wanted to thank you for handling this so respectfully. We were all worried this would turn into a big fight, but you've shown more patience than anyone I've seen." David smiled as he read the message. It reminded him why he'd chosen to stay calm through everything. Anger might have gotten attention, but respect got results. A few days later, the county officials arrived to oversee the paperwork transfer. David walked with them across the field one last time before the sale was finalized. The playground was busy that morning, kids laughing and parents chatting on the benches. It was a scene filled with life, and David couldn't help but feel proud knowing that he had helped preserve it. One of the county inspectors turned to him and said, "You know, most people would have gone straight to court over something like this." David chuckled softly. "Maybe, but sometimes fighting just makes things worse. My father always told me, if you know the truth, you don't have to shout it." When everything was signed and sealed, the HOA issued a public notice to the residents. It explained the situation clearly. The land had originally belonged to David's family and was mistakenly included in the community plan. They apologized for the misunderstanding and thanked David for his cooperation. Many residents came by to shake his hand and thank him personally. One young man said, "I grew up playing on that trail. I'm glad you didn't make them tear it down." David smiled kindly. "I wouldn't take away something people enjoy. My father used to say land is only as good as the happiness it brings." As the days went by, word of the story spread beyond the neighborhood. Local newspapers picked it up, writing headlines like, Man accused of trespassing turns out to be the real owner. Reporters called it a reminder about honesty, patience, and knowing your rights. David didn't seek any attention, but he couldn't help but laugh when he saw how much interest it got. Friends and old acquaintances reached out to congratulate him, saying how proud his father would have been. But for David, the real satisfaction wasn't in the recognition. It was in the peace that came from knowing everything had been put right. The mistake was corrected, the land respected, and the people who once doubted him now saw him in a new light. One afternoon, the HOA president stopped by his house. He looked humbled, holding a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note signed by every member of the board. It read, "Thank you for your patience and for reminding us what fairness truly means." They also enclosed a formal apology for how they had treated him that first day. David read the note quietly, then looked up and smiled. "Thank you," he said. "I know it wasn't easy for any of you." After the president left, David walked out to the edge of his remaining land. The sun was setting, painting the sky with gold and orange. The sound of children playing drifted through the air again. He thought about how easily the whole situation could have turned bitter. But instead it had ended in understanding. He whispered softly to himself, "You were right, Dad. The land remembers." The wind rustled through the trees, almost as if agreeing with him. David stood there for a while longer, feeling the cool evening air on his face. He didn't just protect his rights. He had protected his father's legacy and shown that patience and honesty could still win in a world that often rushed to judgment. For the first time in a long while, he felt complete peace. He turned back toward his home, the sky fading into twilight behind him. The past few weeks had tested him in ways he never expected, but in the end he walked away with more than land. He walked away with respect, from others and from himself. Months had passed since the final agreement with the HOA, and life around the neighborhood had settled into a quiet rhythm again. The playground still echoed with laughter, the walking trail was busier than ever, and the homeowners no longer avoided looking in David's direction when they saw his old truck driving by. The tension that had once filled the air had faded, replaced by a sense of calm understanding. For David, those months were peaceful, but full of reflection. Every morning he walked along the edge of his remaining land, the same stretch he used to explore with his father as a boy. The grass was taller now, the soil still rich and steady under his boots. He often stopped by the old oak tree that marked the center of the property, his father's favorite spot. There he would sit on a smooth rock and take in the view, feeling that same quiet pride he had known as a child. The money he received from selling the overlapping land was fair, but it wasn't what made him feel satisfied. It was knowing that his father's land had finally been recognized and respected. The boundary lines were fixed, the records corrected, and the developer had publicly taken responsibility for the mistake. For David, that was all he had wanted. A little truth, a little fairness, and a reminder that doing things the right way still mattered. But he didn't let the money sit idle. Instead, he used part of it to bring life back to the rest of the property. He repaired the fence that had been broken for years, cleared the dry brush, and planted rows of fruit trees along the southern edge. What had once been forgotten land was slowly turning into something beautiful again. One afternoon, as he was working, a group of children from the neighborhood walked by. They stopped at the fence, curious to see what he was doing. "Are you building a farm?" one of them asked with wide eyes. David smiled and shook his head. "Not exactly. Just planting a few trees." "What kind of trees?" another asked. "Apples, peaches, maybe some plums," he said. "They take time to grow, though. You'll have to be patient." The children nodded seriously, as if they understood the weight of that word, patience. Then one of them grinned. "Can we come help?" David laughed softly. "Sure, but only if you don't mind getting your hands dirty." The next weekend, several families from the neighborhood showed up. Some brought shovels, others brought food. What started as a small planting project turned into a community gathering. People laughed, worked together, and shared stories. Even the HOA president came by to lend a hand, smiling sheepishly when he saw David. "Didn't think I'd see the day," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead. David chuckled. "Guess the land brings people together after all." By evening, the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. Rows of young trees stood proudly in the ground, their leaves rustling in the breeze. The air smelled of soil and fresh beginnings. David looked around and saw faces filled with contentment. Neighbors who had once been strangers now laughing side by side. After everyone left, David stood alone for a while, looking over the land. The quiet hum of crickets began to fill the night. He thought about how far things had come, from being accused of trespassing to being thanked for his patience and fairness. It almost felt like life had come full circle. That night, as he sat on his porch, he opened the old folder again, the same one that had started everything. He took out his father's map, the one drawn by hand, edges frayed and ink faded. He laid it across the table and smiled. Every line, every marking still matched perfectly with the land he now cared for. He whispered softly, "You were right, Dad. It did mean something after all." The next morning, David drove into town. The local paper had done a follow-up story about him, calling him the man who owned the land beneath the HOA. It had become something of a small-town legend. People saw him in the grocery store and stopped to shake his hand or thank him for being so calm through it all. One man at the cafe said, "You handled it better than most would have. You taught everyone a lesson in patience." David smiled modestly. "I just did what I thought was right," the man nodded. Still, not many people would have done it like that. David didn't say much more. He wasn't the type to bask in attention. For him, the story was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about doing right by his father's memory and keeping his word to himself. He knew that anger could have destroyed everything, but patience had repaired it instead. As spring turned to summer, the young orchard began to sprout tiny green buds. The land felt alive again. Every time David walked among the trees, he thought of how something good had grown from something that once seemed like a problem. One day, the same woman who had emailed him months earlier stopped by with her children. She handed him a small wooden sign that read, "Heritage Grove." "We thought it would be nice to name it after what it stands for," she said. "It's part of the community now, a reminder of how honesty can build more than fences." David was touched. He placed the sign near the fence where everyone could see it. It wasn't grand or fancy, but it meant something. It was a piece of shared history, a mark of respect between neighbors who had once stood on opposite sides of a mistake. Years later, the trees grew tall and full, heavy with fruit. Children who once helped plant them now brought their own kids to pick apples and peaches in the summer. People called it a small miracle, but David never saw it that way. To him, it was simple. The land had given back what it always promised, life, if cared for with patience and respect. Sometimes, when he sat under the shade of the oldest tree, he'd see families walking along the trail in the distance. They waved to him and he waved back, content. The past was behind him, but it had left something beautiful behind. And every now and then, when someone new in town asked about the story, the one about the man who was told he was trespassing on his own land, neighbors would smile and point toward the grove. They'd say, "That's him." The land was his all along, and David would just laugh softly, tip his hat and say, "It still is in a way." He never let pride or anger lead him. He led with patience, truth, and respect, and that made all the difference. In the end, he didn't just win back his land. He gained something much greater, a community that finally understood what his father had always taught him, that real ownership isn't just about having land. It's about how you care for it and the people who share it with you.